The Third Crusade 1189 to 1192 stands as one of the most magnificent and dramatic chapters in medieval history. Its narrative woven around the figures of two extraordinary individuals whose charisma and military brilliance defined their respective ages: the West's valiant warrior, King Richard I the Lionheart, and the East's noble and deeply religious Sultan, Saladin Salah-ad-Din. He Lionheart, and the East's noble and deeply religious Sultan, Saladin Salah-ad-Din. This crusade was Europe's furious and urgent response to the fall of Jerusalem in 1187, a disaster precipitated by Saladin's mastery in annihilating the Crusader army at the Battle of Hadin. While Saladin exhibited his strategic genius, piety, and unprecedented ability to unify the fragmented Muslim world, Richard arrived on the Holy Land with unmatched naval power, tactical ferocity, and an almost mythical aura of personal courage. This conflict was not merely a territorial struggle. It was a civilizational clash that produced both moments of stark battlefield savagery and, in the course of diplomatic negotiation, an unexpected mutual respect that ultimately shaped the outcome of this bloody epic. Dive into the epic clash of civilizations. Read the full story of Richard versus Saladin and discover the legacy of the Third Crusade's greatest rivals. The rivalry between King Richard I of England, known to history as the Lionheart, and the Sultan Saladin, the great Muslim unifier, forms the dramatic and defining core of the Third Crusade 1189 to 1192. This period of conflict in the Holy Land is not merely a chronicle of battles, but a clash of two formidable military and political geniuses who, despite their profound differences, came to develop a strange and powerful mutual respect. To understand their epic confrontation, one must first look at the catastrophic event that necessitated the crusade: the fall of Jerusalem. The fall of Jerusalem and the Battle of Hadin 1187. Saladin Salah-ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub had spent decades consolidating Muslim power across Egypt and Syria, successfully uniting the formerly fragmented territories under the banner of the Ayyubid dynasty. His ultimate objective was the expulsion of the Crusader states and the recovery of Jerusalem, the third holiest city in Islam. Saladin was driven by piety and a profound commitment to the concept of jihad, understood in this context as a righteous struggle to liberate Islamic lands. The immediate catalyst for war was the aggressive action of the Crusader prince, Reginald of Chatillon, who routinely violated truces and preyed upon Muslim trade and pilgrim caravans. When Reginald attacked a great caravan in 1187, Saladin, who had recently concluded a truce with the Crusaders, swore a personal oath to kill him. Saladin immediately mobilized his forces, estimated at between 20,000 and 40,000 men, a force that vastly outmatched the Crusader field army. The Crusader leadership, riven by political factions, made a catastrophic error in judgment. Under the command of King Guy of Lusignan, the army of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, numbering around 18,000 to 20,000, abandoned their well-watered camp at Sepharia in July 1187 to march to the relief of the besieged city of Tiberias. This decision forced the Crusaders across an arid, sun-scorched plain in the height of summer, a tactical blunder Saladin immediately capitalized on. The Battle of Hadin, July 4, 1187 became Saladin's masterpiece of strategic exhaustion and maneuver. His forces constantly harassed the Crusaders, blocking their access to water, and setting the dry brush ablaze to choke and disorient them with smoke. By the time the Crusaders reached the horns of Hadin, they were completely dehydrated, exhausted, and demoralized. Saladin's army encircled them, maintaining a relentless barrage of arrows. The Christian forces, lacking discipline and physical stamina, were unable to effectively hold their ranks. The final collapse was swift and total. Saladin had neutralized the entire Crusader army in a single day, capturing King Guy and, most importantly, the cherished relic of the True Cross. Saladin upheld his oath by personally executing Reginald of Chatillon, but spared the other nobles. However, he ordered the beheading of nearly all captured members of the Knights Templar and Hospitaller, recognizing them as the most dedicated and dangerous of his enemies. The obliteration of the Christian army left the Crusader states virtually defenseless. Saladin swept through the principalities, taking city after city. On October 2, 1187, Jerusalem surrendered to Saladin after a short siege. In a display of chivalry rare for the time, Saladin permitted the Crusaders to ransom their citizens and allowed for a relatively peaceful transfer of power, famously contrasting with the bloody massacre that followed the First Crusade's conquest of the city in 1099. The loss of the Holy City sent a political and religious earthquake through Europe, leading to Pope Gregory VIII's immediate call for the Third Crusade. The arrival of the Lionheart and the Siege of Acre 1189–1191. The response to the call for a new crusade was unprecedented, drawing the three most powerful rulers of Europe: the elderly Holy Roman Emperor Frederick I Barbarossa, King Philip II of France Philip Augustus, and King Richard I of England the Lionheart. While Frederick tragically drowned en route and his army largely dispersed, Richard and Philip, two uneasy rivals, finally reached the Holy Land in 1191. Richard's journey itself was a dramatic affair, marked by his detour to the island of Cyprus, which he conquered in a swift, brutal campaign. This acquisition served multiple purposes. It provided a vital strategic base, a crucial supply station, and a source of much-needed funds. By the time Richard arrived at the Siege of Acre in June 1191, the Crusaders had been locked in a grinding, 2-year-long double siege. The Christian forces were besieging the Muslim-held city, while Saladin's own field army was simultaneously besieging the besiegers. Richard's arrival, shortly after Philip's, was transformative. Despite being struck down by a severe illness, likely a form of malaria or scurvy, Richard demonstrated his tactical ferocity. He deployed massive new siege engines, one famously named God's Own Catapult and another, the Bad Neighbor, that quickly began to breach the city walls. In a legendary display of bravado, Richard, too weak to walk, was reportedly carried out on a stretcher to the front lines, where he commanded and even fired his crossbow. The combined efforts of the kings finally broke the city's resistance, and the garrison of Acre surrendered on July 12, 1191. The victory was immediately marred by a moment of stunning cruelty that defined the war's bitter stakes. Richard demanded the return of the True Cross, 1,600 previously captured Christian prisoners, and a massive ransom of 20,000 gold pieces from Saladin in exchange for the captured Acre garrison. When Saladin failed to meet the deadline, reportedly over a dispute as to which side should deliver its prisoners first, Richard, intent on sending a brutal message, ordered the execution of up to 2,700 Muslim prisoners, including women and children, near the hill of Ayadi, in full view of Saladin's camp. Saladin, outraged, immediately ordered the retaliatory execution of his own Christian captives. The conflict was now a total war, fueled by mutual savagery and a deep religious conviction. The march to Jaffa and the Battle of Arsuf 1191. With Acre secured, Philip II soon departed for France, leaving Richard as the undisputed, though sole, commander of the crusade. Richard's next strategic objective was Jaffa, a key coastal port 80 miles to the south, which he intended to use as a logistical base for the eventual assault on Jerusalem. Richard's subsequent march along the coast became a masterclass in controlled movement, demonstrating his deep understanding of the lessons of Haddon. He moved slowly and deliberately, ensuring constant supply of fresh water and food from ships moving along the coast. Crucially, he organized his army of approximately 12,000 men into a rigid, multi-layered column, with the infantry creating a mobile shield for the heavy cavalry, and the sea protecting one flank. Saladin's army, estimated to be more than twice the size of Richard's, shadowed the column, launching constant hit-and-run attacks. Saladin's strategy was simple: break the Crusaders' discipline, exhaust them, and force them into a disorganized charge that his superior cavalry could surround and destroy, just as he had done at Haddon. For days, the Crusader column endured this torment, with Richard repeatedly ordering his frustrated knights to hold their positions, maintaining perfect discipline in the face of immense provocation. The tension broke on September 7, 1191, near the woods of Arsuf. As the Crusaders crossed the plains, Saladin committed his full army, a force of over 25,000 men, in a desperate attempt to shatter the Crusader formation. The Knights Hospitaller, forming the vulnerable rear guard, could finally take no more. Against Richard's direct orders, they charged the surrounding Muslim forces. Seeing his planned defense crumble, Richard was forced to commit to the attack immediately, blowing the signal for a full, coordinated countercharge. The heavy Crusader cavalry, disciplined despite the initial break, crashed into the Muslim lines with devastating force. The surprise and weight of the attack shattered Saladin's formations. Saladin's army suffered a catastrophic loss of nearly 7,000 men, while Richard lost only about 700. Richard had not only won the battle but had defeated Saladin in a pitched field engagement, shattering the Sultan's reputation for invincibility. The War of Logistics and Morale 1191–1192. Despite the military victory at Arsuf, the war was far from over. Saladin, recognizing Richard's genius in direct combat, shifted his strategy entirely to a war of logistics and morale. His new goal was not to defeat Richard in battle, but to make the crusade strategically impossible. Saladin began a devastating campaign of scorched earth, systematically destroying every fort, village, and, most importantly, every supply-rich coastal city including Ashkelon that Richard might use as a base for an attack on Jerusalem. This forced Richard and his crusaders to spend their precious time and resources on rebuilding and fortifying supply lines, turning the knights into disgruntled laborers. Richard, the only one who truly understood the need for a sustained, secure base of operations, found himself increasingly isolated. The crusaders, their morale sinking, wanted to charge Jerusalem immediately. Richard led to advances on the Holy City, once reaching within 12 miles, but both times he prudently turned back, recognizing that he lacked the necessary supplies and manpower for a successful siege and, critically, for holding the city against a determined counterattack. During this stalemate, a fascinating dynamic developed between the two adversaries. Richard and Saladin engaged in frequent diplomatic exchanges, often through Saladin's brother, Al-Adil. Though they never met, they exchanged gifts and courtesies, and a profound mutual respect blossomed. Richard admired Saladin's honor and wisdom, while Saladin recognized Richard as the bravest and most formidable warrior he had ever faced. Richard even proposed a radical peace plan, a marriage between his sister, Joanna, and Al-Adil, with the couple ruling the Holy Land together. The plan, though it foundered on religious grounds, highlighted the unusual personal bond that transcended the conflict. The final showdown at Jaffa 1192. As the political situation deteriorated for Richard with Philip plotting to seize his lands in France, he knew he had to wrap up the crusade. Saladin, informed of Richard's pressures, saw his final opportunity to break the king. While Richard was away at Acre rallying troops, Saladin launched a massive, sudden attack on the key port of Jaffa in July 1192. The city quickly fell, and the surviving Christian defenders were trapped in the citadel, about to surrender. Richard, alerted to the disaster, sailed immediately and arrived at Jaffa to see Saladin's banners flying. In a moment of pure, reckless courage that defined the Lionheart legend, Richard jumped from his ship and personally led a tiny force of men ashore, plunging directly into the heart of the unsuspecting Muslim camp outside the city. The audacity of the attack, combined with Richard's ferocious personal fighting, stunned Saladin's men, who retreated from the city in panic. Saladin immediately regrouped and launched a decisive counterattack on August 4, 1192. Richard had only about 2,000 men, including a mere handful of knights, facing Saladin's army of 15,000, a 5-1 advantage. Richard arrayed his men in a tight defensive square, a hedgehog of lances and shields, utilizing the revolutionary tactic of coordinated, rolling volleys of crossbow fire. The Muslim cavalry, repeatedly charging and suffering heavy losses from the unrelenting bolts, were unable to break the Crusader line. The Christians held firm, and Saladin's army grew exhausted and demoralized. Sensing the Muslim will breaking, Richard led the few remaining knights in a final, devastating charge that routed the entire Ayyubid army. The military outcome was astonishing. Saladin lost 700 men and 1,500 horses, while Richard lost only 2 men. Richard had won his final battle against Saladin, the treaty and the legacy. Following the Battle of Jaffa, Richard's body finally surrendered to the strain of 2 years of campaigning, and he fell critically ill. Saladin, rather than pressing his advantage, sent his own physician to treat his ailing rival, an act of chivalry that has resonated through history. With both great leaders exhausted and facing internal pressures, a negotiated end to the conflict was inevitable. On September 2, 1192, Richard and Saladin signed the Treaty of Jaffa. The agreement was a brilliant compromise. Saladin retained his greatest prize, Jerusalem, but guaranteed that Christian pilgrims would be granted safe and free passage to visit the holy sites. The Crusaders were allowed to retain a narrow, but economically vital, strip of the coast from Tyre to Jaffa, A truce was declared for 3 years. Richard departed the Holy Land in October 1192, hailed as a heroic warrior who had won every battle he fought against Saladin, yet he had ultimately failed to achieve the Crusade's primary goal, the recapture of Jerusalem. He would never return to the Holy Land. Saladin, worn out by years of relentless warfare and administration, passed away less than a year later, in March 1193. The profound legacy of their rivalry is not defined by who won or lost Jerusalem, but by the extraordinary example of two enemies who demonstrated military genius, political cunning, and a mutual, almost chivalric, respect that transcended the deepest religious and cultural divisions of the medieval world. The Third Crusade ultimately did not conclude with a definitive victory or defeat, but rather with a strategic stalemate codified in the Treaty of Jaffa, which became its most enduring legacy. Although King Richard failed to achieve his primary, soul-stirring goal of permanently recapturing Jerusalem, he succeeded in shattering the myth of Saladin's invincibility, defeating him in every major engagement, including the decisive victories at Arsuf and Jaffa, and securing the continued, albeit fragile, existence of the Crusader states along the coast. Saladin, on the other hand, maintained his greatest prize, Muslim control over Jerusalem, while demonstrating profound political wisdom and magnanimity by guaranteeing safe passage for Christian pilgrims to the holy sites. The Crusade is best remembered not for its military conquests, but as a compelling human drama illustrating the deep mutual respect that blossomed between two enemies. A respect so strong it famously led the Sultan to send aid to his ailing rival during a truce. Though both great adversaries passed away soon after the conflict ended, the Third Crusade permanently altered the balance of power in the Levant, leaving behind a heroic narrative filled with unparalleled displays of valor, military genius, and unexpected moments of shared humanity. If you were captivated by this epic duel, hit the like button and subscribe for more historical deep dives.